Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining Day 2 of the First Nations Fisheries Council 2001 Fall Assembly. The focus of today is on the full spectrum of perspectives on the status of Pacific salmon, and some, but not all, of the opportunities and obstacles that we face in the protection, restoration, and management. Salmon is an iconic species, and to many First Nations, it's integral to the identity and existence. It is not just food. It is directly connected to our culture, economy, and well-being. To start the day, Nuchatlaht Councillor Archie Little and Muchalaht Lands and Resources and Fisheries Manager Roger Dunlop, together, they will tell us about the concept of salmon parks following the presentation of the recently released video.
Where we are today is IR 18, known as Sakana. Muchalaht people, we were always known as very hospitable, to always welcome with open arms. Fishing was always the way of life, be as it may in the river or in the ocean. Fishing was the main thing for a lot of our people. I've been fishing with my dad and mother since I was 10, so 41 years of my life I've been fishing. It's our belief there that what we take from the river, we have to give back. And so when we do, NOS up there is going to give us more fish the following year. When I go fishing by myself there, that's what I do. I talk to my grandma and my dad. Salmon plays a big part in our lives. What I catch at the river myself, that all comes to me and my wife and my kids. When I was a kid, in one night we could catch 600. Today, it would take you weeks upon weeks to get that much. They say in 20 years, we're gonna have no salmon.
We used to actually just do this for food fish, actually, not to sell. But now that we can sell, and we're practicing our rights, it helps us out. We only take what we're supposed to take and make sure there's still some left for 5 years down the road.
Have you seen changes in the fish stocks over the years, or?
Yeah. It's changed lots. Our rivers are pretty low. We'll see how much future we'll have in this fishery, and I hope it stays for a while.
The relationship between Indigenous people and salmon, seemingly wherever you go in British Columbia, is entirely connected. When the salmon didn't show up, we called ourselves a poor people. When the salmon showed up, we would talk about ourselves as a wealthy people. The annual cycle of the salmon fishery requires a well-maintained, well-looked after, largely undisturbed habitat that this institution, the provincial government, wants access to. And so there is this inherent conflict with salmon. At the very beginning, it was a relationship of trade and sustenance. Indigenous trade with the first European settlers that showed up was a provisioning relationship. And then the European settlers were trying to disassociate Indigenous people from the fishery once they saw the incredible wealth. And then they created laws and made it illegal for Indigenous people to fish. And so it was that disassociation and then dysfunctional policy that followed it that really have us in the situation that we're in today. The salmon fishery has gone from being an unbelievable, plentiful number of salmon every year returning to our creeks, streams, and rivers to almost none.
Male, 55 male.
This is mark and recapture tagging program for the Muchalaht First Nation. It gives a number on how much fish are actually in the river system, in the tagging pool. We take out all of the hatchery salmon out of the system because we just want wild ones to spawn, not hatchery. Better genetics and wild. They know what river they're from because of something that the river gives off. That's in their DNA. They start off as smolts and they'll stay in the river system until they get so big, and then they'll slowly venture out further into the ocean until they get big enough. Then they come back whenever they're ready to spawn. If we didn't have hatchery fish, I think we'd be in a lot of trouble. There might not be no wild salmon in like 30 years.
Why is that?
Because they're not doing nothing to get rid of all the logging against our major river systems.
They slated this area for really intensive logging, right? And it's in the land use plan, the master plan, and it's been in place since the 90s. When I got here, there were a few watersheds here that hadn't been logged. Now there are none.
So take a look at the very dark timber on the tops of the mountain. That's what old growth looks like. And then down below, you can see it's lighter green and smaller trees. That's second growth. That's a little bit of the only old growth remaining along the Aquaculture River is that little patch up there. 80–90% of the trees were removed already, and some a second time.
10,000 years ago, this place was glaciated, bald with rocks and gravel. Slowly, the vegetation changed from sagebrush to montane forest to evolve to the forest we have today over the last 12,000 years. With that has evolved this complex salmon habitat that's stabilized by intertwining root strength that only occurs in conifers. So when you cut them down on the stream banks, they're no longer holding the stream banks together, and the stream can widen out. So there's no place for the stream-bearing fish to rear, and it's going to be hundreds of years before that can be established. You look around at this hillside, all these faster-growing trees, the young, faster-growing trees from 50 to 60 years out, use much more water than older forest. So beyond 60 years, the trees start to having a reduced water demand. So at least half of the water that should be coming down here is sucked up by the new trees all around us. And this is an unrealized problem that's all over British Columbia. The rate of disturbance was once every 600 years, and now we're disturbing every bit of the landscape again in 50 or 60 years or less. So we're increasing the rate of disturbance by tenfold. And they cut 1,000 hectares a year in this tree farm. So there's really only like 15 or 17 years left till it's all gone. Anything that can be reached and used for lumber, all of it, gone.
Salmon, when you break that cycle, that annual cycle that they require in order to spawn, salmon have no chance. And so, you know, as kind of my colleagues are kind of wandering around in this building, wondering where the salmon went, well, we know where they went. Those salmon runs went extinct because we've harvested their home. When we say we want the wild salmon to return, we're going to have the restraint to preserve that habitat from the headwaters of those rivers all the way through to the ocean and back again.
This is Ahousaht Creek, the Tayahutwa sockeye stream from the Nuchatlaht tribe. Probably one of the best bits of salmon habitat we have left in the 40 rivers in Nootka Sound. These big pieces of wood hold these creeks together, and they force water to scour pools out, and they make really good fish habitat. There's vegetation right to the water's edge, and all of this is lost once it's logged and the peak flows increase as a result. The only solution is to allow the forest to grow back for hundreds of years and recover the streams. And that's the idea behind a salmon park, because only the trees can mend these streams. In Canada, at least 50% of all the habitat restoration and offset programs fail completely. And those 50% that did succeed did not necessarily meet their objectives of producing more fish. Our idea is to capture key watersheds in parks so they'll be protected from industrial extraction and they'll be allowed to heal. We know that all the king's horses and all the king's men cannot put these rivers back together again. Let the forest grow back in some places where they're key habitat areas, where there's high fish productivity values, still allow, industrial activity on other parts of the landscape, but perhaps at a more sustainable rate.
We have a belief in our Nuchatlaht land where Hishuk is Tsawak, where everything is one, everything is connected. It was a direction from our Ahousaht that we start managing, that we start protecting. And I think we have to step back in time, because it was the First Nations that taught the non-Aboriginals how to fish, where to fish, when to fish. We have to get back to that. And that's helping each other. We have to make this healthy. We have to make this strong. We have to ensure the fish come back every year, so there's always some left for the next generation. We'll never see the end of the work, but we have to start it.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us here today. I'd like to say hi to Michelle. Your sister says she misses you already. I'd like to say hello to many of my friends out there at the First Nations Fisheries Council, and there's a lot of brain power here and a lot of leadership, and thanks for letting us have the opportunity to talk. I'm going to quickly tell you a little bit of how this started, and then I'm going to turn it over to Archie. So I'll try not to hog the floor. So how this all started was that the Ahousaht of the Nuchatlaht First Nation asked me to go with his son, who is now the Ahousaht of Nuchatlaht himself, and have a look at this stream where Western Forest Products had been logging and created some blowdown. And we went and looked at it, and yeah, sure enough, there'd been some blowdown that got too close to the stream. But this was the last stream, the very last stream in Nuchatlaht's territory, and it was the Ty's sockeye stream, and only a Ty can own a sockeye stream in Nuchatlaht culture. So we looked at it, and we talked about it, and then we said, well, why don't we just say no? Can't log anymore. You got to stop. This is for the fish and people. So that's how the idea came to be, and as we went along, we came up with the idea of salmon parks. So in our discussion, we were looking at the map and thought, well, if we protect Ahousaht, what other key piece of real estate contains fish production? So we came up with a couple of other creeks and watersheds at Shoemaker and Ransom Creek in Inner Basin. And when we looked at it, it looked like it would preserve 90% of the fish productivity in Nuchatlaht's territory by taking 20% of the land out of the logging equation. And you could still, have some economic activity on the rest of the land base, but not hammering fish. So that's how it got started. One other thing I want to let people know is that on this kind of stuff, First Nations can be in the driver's seat. Your rights under the Constitution Act trump, as far as I can tell, are the only thing that can trump corporate interests and how they're given such high rights here. But I just wanted to mention that. And I want to say thanks to a lot of people who were involved. Carter Kirilenko, Canadian Parks and Wilderness Association sponsored us, and we had assistance from a lady called Beth Eden in the production and organizing. And Mike McQuina, Jerry Jack, and the other Mowachaht chiefs supported this, as did the Nuchatlaht First Nation. And I'm hoping this is a contagious idea. Right now, the state of these salmon parks is they've been declared as salmon parks under Nuchatlaht law by the chiefs of the nations. And now our challenge is to have that recognized by the province. And there's a bunch of things going along that are hopefully going to help it along the way. Having said far too much, I'm going to be quiet and turn it over to one of my best friends, Archie Little. Thanks.
Thank you, Roger. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I just want to start out by saying, excuse me, that the hotware need to own the resources. The hotware need to manage, protect, enhance, access, and of course sharing all resources. But it starts with the hotware. And we were thousands and thousands of years of having our wealth was abundance. We had lots of everything, and we entrusted the federal government and the provincial government to manage that wealth. And they managed that wealth through licenses, just accessing and accessing. And where time came where licenses became more important than managing a wealth, managing an abundance. And pretty soon we're in trouble. We're short, we're low on everything. We're not wealthy people anymore because we're poor. There's very little salmon. And so we went through history, always managing for abundance, always taking what we need and sharing what we access, that we were always respectful to Mother Earth, and that and the other thing that we need to focus on is that we need to have local management where there's local benefits. When we started this process of protecting Ahousaht, the company, the forestry company, told us they had to ask their bosses in New York, and I said, no, your boss is sitting right here, or Ahousaht. That's the person that owns that, and we need to protect. A park has to extend way past a system, because we believe what you do at the top of the mountain has a direct impact on what happens in the estuary, and we need to think like that. We need to manage like that. That would be respectful of what's there, and we also believe that if we have healthy waters, we have healthy fish, we have healthy people, we have happy people, we have fish that are coming back healthy and strong, and we need to get away from TFO not managing first with conservation and then First Nations rights. That we need to get them to start thinking that those two things come first. And First Nations are always the first ones to give up. We're always saying, no, we can't access anymore. But no, TFO just keeps going on and accessing. And, and also one of the scary statements that I heard is that no salmon, no more Indian problem. As well, we have to get out of that way of thinking, and we have to ensure, we have to push that we did it for thousands and thousands of years, that we were successful in what we did. We shared what we had. Everybody benefited from our wealth because our hotware shared what they had, and so now we're looking for solutions. How do we help? How do we be part of a process that's going to ensure that there are healthy stocks, that there are healthy fish, returning to our areas, and we know the importance of the large systems, the Fraser, the Nass, and all those systems. But we believe on the West Coast that these little streams, these little creeks, are the backbone of our fisheries. and we need to manage as such, to ensure that our stocks remain healthy, our stocks become strong, that we become wealthy again, wealthy in abundance, and of course we'll share that, and we've done this through the hereditary system, what Nuchatlaht is today. We have no elections, so we ask everybody to be part of a process where the community stays strong and healthy, and everyone plays a part. But we also must look at, where did DFO fail? Where did the federal and provincial governments fail? They failed where they allowed the licenses to be worth more than the resources. We had more licenses than resources. You look at all the seine boats that we had on the coast, thousands of boats. That's managing on wealth. We did not protect the stocks to ensure that they will come back, and that our children and grandchildren will benefit and enjoy a good salmon meal whenever they want. I eat fish 5 days a week because I'm a First Nations person, and that's my diet. And I see I'm at 5 seconds, so ako, Joe.
I have to say, at this moment, my klimaksti is full. You and the production of that video and all of the work that you both and everyone has put into that is amazing. And to think the very community that welcomed the Mamachni are the same ones offering the solution to a much larger problem that we see in Canada. I can only say this: we must call on the Prime Minister as well in his attempt to preserve 20% of our oceans for marine parks to join force with you and everyone else working on salmon parks to ensure that this is done for our Caucus people, British Columbians, Canadians, and the world. And of course, our whale population. And they have taught us so much. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. I am so proud to be Nuchatlaht today. You moved me to tears in that video. My sister, hello, I'm pretty sure she can hear you. She's probably next door to Roger in her office. So thank you again, gentlemen. Thank you, Nuchatlaht, for sharing that. Thank you, for always bringing forth the teachings and sharing your hupaquinum. It is much appreciated. We'll now move to the other spectrum, which is at the international scale, the Pacific Salmon Treaty and the First Nations Caucus at the Pacific Salmon Commission. Let's hear an overview on the role of the First Nations in international fisheries from Gordon Sterritt, the chair of the First Nations Caucus.
Amasilka. Good afternoon. My name is Gord Sterritt, and I'm the chair of the First Nations Caucus of the Pacific Salmon Commission. I'm here to provide you an overview of the First Nations Caucus and the activities of the First Nations Caucus over the last few years. Just a little bit of background. The Pacific Salmon Commission was established in 1985 by Canada and the United States to implement the Pacific Salmon Treaty. To assist in implementing the PST, the Commission is supported by 4 bilateral advisory panels and an assortment of technical committees. Collectively, the panels and technical committees provide recommendations on salmon management and fisheries under the PST to the Commission to help its overall guidance for implementing that Pacific Salmon Treaty. Canadian membership on the panels includes multiple interests like DFO, First Nations, the recreational and commercial harvesting sectors, and the environmental and community interests. Canadian participants are appointed at 2 levels. Commissioner seats are filled through appointment by the minister, and appointments to the panels and technical committees are made by the regional director of the Pacific region. Participation in the process is sought by DFO to broadly represent the interests of Canada. The First Nations Caucus is made up of 26 plus First Nations delegates to the PSC process. All are encouraged to participate on the First Nations Caucus, and caucus members participate at the commissioner, panels, and technical committee levels. In addition, caucus members also participate in a number of different working groups and committees associated with the PSC. The caucus has been meeting within the PSC regular schedule of meetings since 2003. Typical meeting schedules include meeting formally in advance of and during the January and February PSC sessions, which are hosted by Canada or the US, depending if being held in Vancouver or Portland. The caucus meetings are in addition to the respective commissioner panel and technical meetings and intersessions or meetings outside of the regular scheduled sessions. The First Nations Caucus contributes to the management and negotiation of the Pacific salmon fisheries in the international context between Canada and the US. It meets to discuss implementation of the Pacific Salmon Treaty each year, as well as reviewing management activities associated with the PSC. Caucus contributes in an advisory role to Canada's delegation to the Pacific Salmon Commission, and the First Nation Caucus provides regional First Nations perspectives and brings forward interests and discussions, but ultimately acts as an advisor to Canada in its current capacity. First Nations in BC actively engage in targeted salmon fisheries, resource management, and enhancement activities. First Nations Caucus participates to provide increased Aboriginal capacity for salmon management, assist First Nations in their relationship with DFO and the Pacific Salmon Commission, assist Canada in its relationship to the US regarding salmon management as prescribed in the PST, and facilitate communication and support among First Nations Caucus members to achieve these objectives. Consistent with UNDRIP and Canada's commitment to Indigenous reconciliation, a modernized approach to First Nations participation at the PSC is necessary, particularly with the decline of salmon stocks and the upcoming negotiations to renew the Pacific Salmon Treaty in 2028. As a result, the First Nations Caucus for the past 2 years has developed a strategic plan to redefine the caucus's role at the PSC and with Canada, and laying out a vision for First Nations in international fisheries management. The plan has 4 main elements. The first is to increase the internal capacity of the caucus. These goals will all require additional capacity and a governance structure and to secure long-term funding to facilitate. Externally, the caucus wants to improve their engagement with First Nations in BC. The caucus will work to establish a process for engaging with First Nations broadly, and this will involve a communications plan building a First Nations technical support network. The third element is to increase First Nations representation at all levels of the PSC and shared chairing responsibilities at meetings. This includes revising how First Nations are nominated to the PSC, the lengths of their terms, and developing a succession plan for First Nations at the Pacific Salmon Commission. The fourth and final element is advancing reconciliation and collaboration for effective fisheries management. This includes fully incorporating First Nations traditional and scientific knowledge, developing First Nations-led fisheries programs, and evolving the Pacific Salmon Treaty from a harvest-based treaty towards holistic fisheries management. With regards to the MOU, the caucus signed an MOU with FNFC to work together under the First Nations Fisheries Council governance structure. The MOU increases the caucus's internal capacity and ability to advance the goals of the strategic plan. This makes use of existing capacity and structures within the FNFC to advance the caucus's strategic goals. The First Nations Fisheries Council role as a convener at the provincial scale gives the ability to facilitate dialogue between the caucus and First Nations in BC. And the caucus will also make use of the First Nation Fisheries Council existing communication structures. The new relationship between the caucus and the First Nations Fisheries Council will support aligning First Nations fisheries management across domestic and international scales. The last subject that I want to touch on is the social cultural study that was completed and finalized this past spring. The First Nations Caucus worked with the US tribes and a company called Earth Economics to develop a report on the social cultural significance of Pacific salmon for tribes and First Nations. This report is available online. The First Nations Fisheries Council can also send out digital copies as well as a flyer that summarizes the key findings and recommendations. The report includes 4 main recommendations that can inform international fisheries management. Shifting priority from salmon harvests to rebuilding salmon populations to ensure that Indigenous communities can meet their food, social, and ceremonial needs now and into the future. Meeting these standards will safeguard multiple benefits extending beyond Indigenous communities. Restoring salmon ecosystems, following holistic principles that draw on both Indigenous and Western science. Funding and supporting Indigenous fisheries and fishery science programs are essential to this effort. Respecting and incorporating Indigenous social cultural values in decision-making alongside Indigenous science and technology in salmon management, and recognizing and supporting the tribes and First Nations as co-managers through reconciliation and fulfillment of both Indigenous sovereignty rights and trust and responsibilities. Hamaya, thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. Next, we'll open the panel discussion about Pacific salmon and international fisheries with John Field, the Executive Secretary of the Pacific Salmon Commission, Murray Ned, and Russ Jones, PSC commissioners and members of the First Nations Caucus. You will have the opportunity to ask questions in Slido. Please stand by for 1 minute as we transition to the panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Field. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Pacific Salmon Commission. Quite an honor to be invited here to the Fall Assembly. This is the first time for me. I look forward to sharing what I can about the Salmon Commission and its organization and setup. I look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon. My name is Murray Ned. My ancestral name is Kwalasantin. I've been with the Commission, serving Canada since 2013. My day job is with the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance as their Executive Director, and I've been on Sumas First Nation Council for 24 years now. And the village I'm from is Sumas First Nation out in the Fraser Valley, one of the Stallo First Nations. Over to you, Russ.
Nuchatlaht. Good day, everyone. My Haida name is Nung Jingwat. I'm calling today from Scargilda, from Skidegate and Haida Gwaii. I've sat on the Pacific Salmon Commission as a commissioner the last two and a half years, and I was previously on the commission for a period of about 10 years, starting in 2001. And I was also on the Northern Panel for about 9 years prior to that. So it's good to have this as an agenda item on the First Nation Fishery Council, and I think this new partnership that we're working on is going to be a good step forward in terms of engagement with First Nations. Hala.
As I said when I introduced myself, I'm the Executive Secretary here at the Salmon Commission headquarters. We're in downtown Vancouver. I'm an American. I moved here in 2012 to take over the job as Executive Secretary. I work with a staff of about 30 people here to assist Canada and the United States in implementing the treaty. The Pacific Salmon Treaty came into force in 1985 after years of negotiations between Canada and the United States. It dissolved a prior treaty from 1937 that just focused on Fraser sockeye and pink salmon. Some of you know the Salmon Commission quite well, serving on it, like Murray and Russ. Others might not know it at all. I'll do my best to give you a flyover and give you some of the fundamentals without boring those who know it quite well. The Salmon Commission is a designated international organization, so we're not part of DFO, we're not part of the American fisheries infrastructure. We're a creature of the Salmon Treaty itself, a creature of the two countries. That means that delegates participating in the Commission enjoy certain diplomatic privileges and immunities. The headquarters here enjoys the same. So we have this sort of quasi-diplomatic status in Canada and the United States. And so we're quite different from a federal or provincial agency. The Commission's a decision-making for cooperative management of Pacific salmon between the United States and Canada. The heads of state that signed the treaty weren't going to be managing salmon off the side of their desk, so they created the Commission to do that for them. The Commission is not alone in the world. There are about 50 similar organizations. Some of them have 2 countries in them. Some of them have several dozen countries in them. But they all have similar remits to implement fisheries agreements and catch allocation and conservation. But I will say the Salmon Commission is almost alone in the world in having such strong Indigenous representatives in equal standing with non-Native representatives around the table. And I'm quite proud of that in PSC's history and its current structure. Finally, I'd say the Commission is the latest step in about 100 years of engagement between Canada and the United States, even going back to the late 1800s when the countries began to fight over Fraser River sockeye and access to it. All through the Commission structure, commissioners like Murray and Russ, our panels, our technical committees, they all have First Nation and or tribal representative from the United States, in addition to non-Native members. And I think that's a strength of the Commission. Our endowment funds, some of you may have heard of that. Our endowment funds were set up in 1999. They distribute about $5 to $10 million a year in grants for salmon research, treaty implementation, habitat restoration. They're open to all members of the public, including First Nation organizations. They are divided in northern and southern regions, and those northern and southern regions in the grant program are administered by 2 committees, both of which have First Nation and tribal representatives on that. Russ, in particular, serves on our Northern Fund Committee for Canada. Closing up here, potential interests that I thought would be of interest to the Council and the delegates here today. I think you just heard from Gord Sterritt that the tribal the First Nation caucus meets regularly in the margins of PSC venues in January and February, similarly for U.S. tribes. The First Nations Fisheries Council leads the First Nation caucus in administration and logistics and organization. The Secretariat, the headquarters staff here in Vancouver, has a number of joint projects with First Nations. We have an agreement with the Namgis Atleo organization up north to run several of our assessment fisheries. Mowachaht First Nation on the west coast of Vancouver Island also has an agreement with us to run assessment fisheries. Murray and I have been working for a couple of years now on an MOU between the PSC and Sumas First Nation and DFO to do research in the lower Fraser. And finally, we have an agreement with the Boston Bar Band to run yet another assessment program for Fraser, sockeye, and pink salmon. We do get significant technical expertise as well from tribal organizations in the U.S., in the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission and the Columbia River Intertribal Fisheries Commission. And I'll wrap up by emphasizing what I think Gord did in his video, the rollout of the sociocultural report. You can download it or get a hard copy from the Secretariat here in Vancouver, emphasizing the importance, the non-economic importance of Pacific salmon to First Nations and tribes. So I'll stop there and hopefully leave a few minutes for Russ and Murray to augment what I said.
Yeah, John, thanks for that. I don't have too much more to add. I want to save more time for dialogue and questions, but I did want to thank the Fisheries Council for allowing me to participate as a panel member and all the good work that they do and for being on a panel with both John and Russ. So thanks for that.
And I think I'll won't say too much more at this point either. In the years I've been on the commission, I've experienced several of the negotiations in 1998, 2008, and 2018. In 2018, I wasn't on the commission, but I was an advisor to the First Nations Caucus. And those are times when there's opportunities for change, and that next opportunity, will be in 2028. And so that's, as Gord mentioned in his presentation, that's one of the things that the caucus is looking at as part of their strategic plan. Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen. And I think we have some questions rolling in, and it's good to see you, Murray. I was in Samath earlier today, and I got out before it started raining. Russ, always good to see you. Nice to meet you, John. I have one I know right from Tracy Winbush, and I actually probably want to know the answer to this. How many women are in leadership roles within the PSC, and how many of them are Indigenous?
I think there are two, from my perspective, there are two parts to that. One is how that is represented in the Secretariat. 3 of the 4 senior staff here are 2 of the 4 senior staff here are women. They are not Native, they are non-Indigenous. There are women leaders throughout the Commission organization. Rebecca Reed serves as the head of the Canadian delegation and RDG for the Pacific region. I can't think of any of our Indigenous panel and technical committee members who are currently co-chairs or leaders in those subsidiary bodies, but Murray and Russ may know more on that front.
All right. Well, we've always got work to do to get our Indigenous women into these leadership positions, so thank you for that. And it's always good to bring awareness. So can you talk about succession planning at the PSC and the First Nations Caucus? How do we get ready for the next round of Pacific Salmon Treaty negotiations?
Russ, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think an important thing is engaging First Nations. And in the past negotiations, there's been fairly limited engagement outside the First Nations Caucus. I know I personally attended several meetings, but often it was at the end of the negotiation, many of the details had already been worked out. And so I think it's important to be engaging at the front end, right, and having a discussion, right, around what's important. As Gord mentioned, the caucus does see that a lot of the issues for 2028 will focus around conservation, right? And because, in the past, the treaty has dealt more with sharing. And although when the treaty was signed, the objective was rebuilding Chinook stocks coast-wide. We have seen a decline in many stocks, in British Columbia as well as Washington and Oregon. And the treaty has made some reductions, but not enough, I guess, to allow some of those depressed stocks to rebuild.
All right.
Michelle, if I could just add to if I could just add to that, I mean, Canada did a complete review of the negotiations leading to 2018, and part of that was succession planning and ensuring Canada had the appropriate capacity moving forward. And so that has a First Nations component to it, which enabled the First Nations Caucus to begin a review of our succession planning, but not only that, more of a strategic planning approach as well. So we're just getting close to finalizing a bit of a draft of that before we roll it out to First Nations and hopefully get engagement from the leadership to seek appropriate guidance for the First Nations Caucus.
Thanks, guys. So what are some of the biggest changes in international fisheries management that you have seen in your time at the Pacific Salmon Commission? Positive changes or negative changes? Russ, I'm going to go to you because you've been there the longest, I think.
Sure. When I first joined the Salmon Commission on the Northern Panel, it was in 1993, and Canada and U.S. were disagreeing about many things in the treaty, and so some of the annexes had lapsed and they hadn't been renewed, and there were actually fish wars, trying to use leverage to try to, get the parties to negotiate an agreement. We ended up with a new treaty and a renewed treaty in 1998, but that was a government-to-government negotiation. In 2008 and 2018, it was actually the Pacific Salmon Commission that led the negotiation, and the panel led the negotiation. So that has been, a fairly big change, and I think it's quite a positive change, right, in terms of the commission working together more on issues, both, between the treaty negotiations, as well as working out plans for how to implement the treaty to better deal with conservation and sharing issues.
All right. Okay, Randy James has a question here. There was a miscount at the mission counting in 2021, which recorded a lower count than the Qualark numbers. If the Qualark numbers were used to make the allocation decision, then it appears that there would have been a First Nations fisheries this year. And I don't know if this falls in your preview or not, but I'll ask the question.
Thanks for that question. I can take an initial stab at it. The Qualark Creek Hydroacoustic Station is run by DFO, and the Mission Hydroacoustic Station is run by my office. And I've heard it said it's sort of like the guy with two watches. He's never really quite sure what time it is. If you have one watch, you're more confident. Qualark and Mission continue to show discrepancies throughout the season. We are, I don't think anyone is saying which one is more accurate overall, but the Fraser panel has agreed to use the Mission count as the default default method for enumerating sockeye runs. There were a number of variables that go into calculating the run size in 2021, as in any year. And yes, there's some uncertainty around that, but the two countries felt confident that they made the best choice they could.
All right, great. Okay, Maxine has a question here. Hello, Murray and Russ. It's good to see you're involved. I'm looking forward to the First Nations taking their rightful place at the decision tables. Please share your thoughts on how we could make this happen.
Good question. Well, I think we need Canada to commit to UNDRIP and DRIPA all through the province as a start. I know that we're dealing with the feds primarily. So to affect change, I think utilizing the articles of UNDRIP is a good way forward. Free, prior, and informed consent for all the nations, all the management actions that occur within your territories is really a way forward. And Canada really coming to the table and implementing reconciliation. They often come to the nations with these initiatives. They make declarations that they're going to seek and make change with nations, but we don't often see it as quickly as we'd like. So as much as it's part of Canada's responsibility, I think it's really up to the nations to push the envelope on those articles of UNDRIP and really finding ways to bring collaboration for First Nations. And speaking with one voice is going to be extremely important moving forward. So I'll keep that response fairly short, and maybe Russ has something to add.
Okay. Russ?
Yeah, I'll just say, we have the First Nation Caucus was started operating around 2001, so it's been operating for quite a few years, and it has really brought First Nation technical capacity, to support the work of the First Nation commissioners and panel, and I think it's made a big difference in terms of our advice to DFO. Currently, the way the process is set up is the panel members and commissioners are appointed as advisors to DFO, and DFO is the decision maker. So that is something that we need to work towards changing that kind of a process. So First Nations are decision makers, in their territory, and UNDRIP provides, a basis for doing that. But we also need to work with First Nation governments or watershed authorities, right, to make sure that those groups that know what's happening in the watershed and can see solutions are involved. And that's both at the international level, but also at the domestic level. So it needs kind of a holistic approach, right? Because you can only do so much, through the Salmon Treaty at the international level. And in many respects, what's happening at the international level is the U.S. can really takes there's only so much you can do if the U.S. takes a position of if they won't do something, and Canada has limited influence. But we need to kind of work together to see how we can increase our influence and achieve some of the objectives that, this next treaty negotiation where we do have, stronger conservation issues in Canada around Chinook salmon, around, sockeye, chum salmon, right? We really, it provides a challenge, but it's also an opportunity to try to get, and it's needed for long-term health and sustainability of the fisheries and the fish.
All right, thanks, guys. Tracy Rimbush has a question. How will UNDRIP and or DRIPA impact the treaty? Does Article 32 bracket 2 have weight? Both of you've touched on UNDRIP and DRIPA. Is there any more that you would add or think to add with respect to the impact on the Pacific Salmon Treaty?
You first, Russ.
I think it's certainly identified in the strategic plan as a strategic factor, right? That can support changes. But those have to be negotiated with in Canada, with government to government, with DFO, right? And then and so that's really around the role of First Nations in these forums, including the Salmon Treaty. And then in terms of the way we work with the U.S., that relationship between the First Nations and the U.S. tribes, is quite a strong one. And we have quite a lot in common. And on the U.S. side, U.S. tribes are recognized as one of the sovereigns on the U.S. side. There's the federal government, there's the tribal government and state governments, right? And they all have to agree before the U.S. Can bring forward positions. Eventually, we'd like to see a similar process on the Canadian side.
Thank you. 30 seconds, Murray.
Yeah, not too much to add, Michelle, other than we serve Canada's interests right now, and we don't have much other leverage. I don't see what other leverage we have besides UNDRIP and DRIPA right now, unfortunately. So really that's our reliance at this point, and hopefully that will affect change for both Canada and nations moving forward in the treaty.
Okay, I have one question. I'm going to give you guys each a couple seconds to answer it. From your perspective as First Nations commissioners at the Pacific Salmon Commission, what brings you hope? What motivates you to continue working on such complicated and charged issues? Murray.
Go ahead, Russ. Oh, Murray, okay. I think the environment for First Nations to work together hasn't been better. I see so much collaboration and interest for First Nations, both at the leadership and the technical scales, willing to work together. And I think that's going to be the driving force moving forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think if you asked me this question 20 years ago, it would be more around sharing and access and more economic access. But I think that question has certainly changed over the last 20 years, where now the question is about survival of species and protection of it. Salmon is a cultural keystone species. Unless we work together to make significant changes, it's at risk, for the future. Thank you.
Thanks. John, do you want to jump in on that?
I would say that what gives me hope and aspirations for the future is that the countries, I think, are coming to a common recognition that there are a lot of non-fishing factors out there affecting salmon recovery and salmon conservation. It is no longer simply a process of allocating a quota, that there has to be a more holistic conversation about what's happening with salmon up and down the coast. And that makes it a very exciting time to be here at the Pacific Salmon Commission. It's transformational.
Excellent. Hawa, Haijka, thank you, and Kleko. Thanks for all your questions, and thanks to our panel for insightful thoughts. We'll now take a 10-minute break and reconvene at 2:07. for an appearance from Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Aquaculture, Finn Donnelly. During the break, we will be showing the Sumas First Nation salmon ceremony.
Oh, you're cool. Hello.
Okay.
What's the up? What's the up? Just let you know we're just waiting for the fish to get here. We'll start. We hope you didn't sell it to somebody else. What we're doing today is honoring the salmon. We're going to have the salmon carried in. Will be slung around the floor, placed on the table. We're going to call for witnesses. Who will speak to the salmon and what the salmon mean to us, for us people. And then we'll open the floor to anybody else who would like to say a few words. Then we'll have a free-for-all. Chuck, Ahousaht, you're asked to be the number one witness here. Go on forward. You're asked to be number two witness. You're asked to be number three. Muchalaht, you're asked to be number four. The four witnesses will be asked to respond to the work at this, once the salmon has been placed on the table, the drumming is finished. Ossium, drumming, please. One, get up at the door.
What the salmon means to our people is food for our people. And every year, we're always constantly fighting for our food fishery, not just with other nations, but to get food for all nations.
I know we are in a time right now where our salmon is becoming very scarce, and that's scary for me because because I remember when I was 18 years old and when I was allowed to go out there and fish, that there was such an abundance that I didn't know what to do with. And then people started fishing, and then I backed away from doing that. Now I buy my fish from whoever's going to sell it to me. So, because I need it, my spirit needs it. We need it to be able to keep that, our family member in our DNA, keeping it strong.
Our ancestors who lived here for thousands of years, the very top layer, are the remains of our ancestors. And anything that grows and eats off the land, the ancestors are feeding us. And so we're all family. We're all brothers.
I fished with my father when I was a teenager. And he taught me all a lot of the ins and outs of the fishing. And there's a lot of members of our community are fishermen. And that's our livelihood.
Many years we've done what we've done by honoring the first salmon, giving himself up for us to help nourish us and to teach us and to pass on those teachings. You know, many years we weren't allowed to do what we're doing here today, but it's good to see that we are continuing on with that we're teaching the young ones here to carry on that tradition.
When the salmon come up every year, we welcome them. They're our brothers coming home to feed us, to help us after the long winters. And so we used to give thanks to the first salmon that came into our homes. We brought the bones back to the river. The old people say, Ahousaht, just don't scatter the bones around and walk on them. They're our brothers.
The work that I do is I want to see fish coming back for our little ones. My little guy's 10. He's been to the river once. And I want to keep those traditions alive. So that's where my heart is with the fishery.
And it's good that the fisheries and our communities and all the chiefs and council and all the, I'll call them heavyweights, are all working together now instead of fighting. And build up the fish supply there. But it doesn't have to be in, it's got to be in, say, the United States too. It's got to be out in the oceans. They all got to work together, and otherwise stocks will never build up. That's why I say.
So the salmon are very sacred to us. We must not choose among them. We must appreciate all of them, because they're all part of our family. I don't remember everything. When I was little, I had to go to residential school, and so I lost some of my teaching, but I do remember some of this. Thank you for listening.
We're going to hand out the salmon at this time. I think the speaker gets it first.
Welcome back, and thanks, Samath, for that great sharing of the salmon ceremony and providing a glimpse into their ceremony, helping better showcase the significance of salmon. We'll now proceed with Finn Donnelly, the Parliamentary Secretary for First Nations Aquaculture. We would also like to congratulate Finn on his recent induction into the Fraser River Discovery Centre Hall of Fame. Finn.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the kind words and introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm joining you virtually from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coquitlam, Katzie, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I bring greetings from Premier John Horgan and Agriculture, Food and Fisheries Minister Lana Popham. My name is Finn Donnelly, Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Aquaculture and MLA for Coquitlam Burke Mountain. My Squamish Nation name is Yim Yoyos, which means strong swimmer in the animal world, or orca. The elders gave me that name because of my conservation work on salmon. It means if the salmon population is strong, then the orca population should be strong, that rely on the salmon. It's a big responsibility I carry around with me every day, which helps focus my work. Thank you for the invitation to speak at your annual General Assembly. I appreciate this opportunity. 1 year ago, I started my new role supporting Minister Popham as Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries and Aquaculture. This is a perfect fit for me, as I've had a lifelong passion for healthy salmon, watersheds, fisheries, the ocean, and its coastal communities. Seafood and fisheries are an important part of the ministry, and now by having a Parliamentary Secretary dedicated to fisheries and aquaculture, this has given our government a chance to renew and strengthen this focus. I am fully committed to working with Indigenous and coastal communities, as well as the federal government in restoring and protecting BC wild salmon. Over the past year, I've had many meaningful and productive discussions. Next slide. We all know there are many factors involved in the decline of wild salmon populations in British Columbia. Since 2017, the Premier and our government have taken actions to protect and restore wild salmon. We engaged in a historic government-to-government process with First Nations in the Broughton Archipelago. Through this dialogue, we reached a landmark agreement supported by industry and workers. This agreement led to companies closing open net salmon farms that were impacting wild salmon on BC's wild salmon migration route. We established a $13 million First Nations-led Guardian and scientific monitoring plan to help to keep an eye on open net salmon farm operations there. Our government has committed to addressing the concerns of First Nations and all British Columbians when it comes to open net salmon farming. In 2018, we announced a new salmon aquaculture policy. This policy makes it clear that effective June 2022, no new tenures along BC's coast will be approved unless the salmon farm operator has negotiated agreements with the First Nation or nations in whose territory they propose to operate. And secondly, that the operator can satisfy the DFO that their salmon farm will not adversely impact wild salmon. This approach provides clarity and outlines our expectations moving forward for a sustainable industry. It is a commitment that protects wild salmon, embraces reconciliation, and provides good jobs for local communities. Currently, we are developing a wild salmon recovery strategy and action plan. We are committed to working with the First Nation Fisheries Council and directly with Indigenous nations, as well as the federal government, to address threats facing BC's wild salmon. Next slide. In 2019, with the federal government, we jointly established the BC Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund. BC SRIF is a 5-year, $143 million contribution program to help BC salmon populations recover in the province. To date, 60 projects have begun and over 20 more are in various stages of negotiations. We have committed to doubling the original investment in BC SRIF along with the federal government and are actively working on that initiative now. The fund supports innovation, infrastructure, and science partnerships to protect and restore priority BC wild salmon and steelhead populations and other fisheries. I know many of you here today have participated in this program. Indigenous partnerships are core to a strong majority of BC Shrift projects. BC Shrift project partners include the Osoyoos Indian Band, supporting post-mudslide restoration and monitoring for the Inkaneep Creek and its floodplain. This important restoration work will improve the sustainability of Okanagan steelhead, rainbow trout, and Chinook salmon. It will also apply an innovative combination of traditional knowledge and Western science towards sustainable fisheries co-management. And the Adams Lake Indian Band are supporting the restoration of the Upper Adams early summer sockeye run to a sustainable level and improving returns. Although the BC Shrift projects are diverse in location, scale, and proponents, together they all contribute to protecting and restoring wild fisheries and creating a more sustainable future for nations, local communities, and workers. Together, we can continue to support both the wild salmon fishery and British Columbians who make their living from them. Next slide. I know my colleague George Heyman, Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, would like me to update you on the successful launch of the Healthy Watersheds Initiative. Communities throughout BC are restoring watersheds and wetlands to protect aquatic ecosystems, which promote healthy environments for British Columbians, wild salmon, and wildlife. This year, more than 60 HWI projects have been launched at more than 200 sites around the province. These projects are restoring rivers and wetlands, creating spawning grounds for salmon, and expanding protection of aquatic species. First Nations and Indigenous-led organizations are managing and participating in many of these projects. Healthy watersheds means healthy communities and a resilient environment. Healthy watersheds and wetlands are critically important for climate adaptation as they reduce impacts and costs from increased floods, droughts, and wildfires. These initiatives are helping communities adapt to climate change by restoring threatened watersheds and wetlands. The Ministry of Environment, Climate Change Strategy is developing a watershed security strategy and an associated fund. As part of my mandate from the Premier, hold on a sec, I continue to support that work. To develop the watershed security strategy and associated fund, we are working with Indigenous peoples and colleagues across government, as well as the public and others during the engagement phases. Next slide. I'm also working closely with my colleague Nathan Cullen, the Minister of State for Lands and Natural Resource Operations, on developing a provincial coastal marine strategy. Our government's goal is to better protect coastal habitat while supporting coastal economies. I'm working with Minister Cullen, First Nations, federal and local governments on a plan to support coastal communities into the future. Next slide. In closing, I believe no one wants to see BC salmon go the way of the Atlantic cod. Without question, British Columbians want us to work with Indigenous leadership as well as federal, local, and community partners to ensure wild Pacific salmon not only survive, but thrive into the future. That's why your work here today is so important. The First Nation Fisheries Council is such a key partner. We cannot be successful without all of you. Thanks again for the invitation to participate in your annual gathering. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you, sharing ideas and working towards our common goal in protecting BC wild salmon. Haichka Osiem. Thank you.
Thanks, Finn. I have a couple questions already coming in, and I'm going to read one that was actually posed to me earlier today. Concern has been expressed by First Nations in BC that economic interests and salmon recovery are competing priorities. How will your mandate be integrated and congruent with the BC salmon strategy to ensure the health and recovery of salmon is not undermined by economic incentives?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and thanks for the question. That is a great question. One area that I've been working on since I would say at least 6 months ago is trying to coordinate with the federal government. Currently, we have a memorandum of understanding with First Nations Fisheries Council. So the province has an agreement and understanding with FNFC. So we have a strong connection with Indigenous leaders, and we need to build on that. But we also need to have a connection with the federal government. And I have been encouraging with our Minister Popham to connect with the federal fisheries minister. We started that discussion before the last election, and we plan on continuing that discussion again with new Minister Murray when she is available to talk with us. We've already sent her our congratulations, when can we meet letter. And that is going to be one of the top priorities, is discussing how the federal PSSI could work with the provincial our wild salmon strategy. So that is a critical initiative that we work together so that we do not undermine fisheries management or wild salmon restoration efforts. So it's a great question. Stay tuned. I hope that we can have positive results in the next short while.
Excellent. And I hope you talk to your colleagues with the forestry files as well, because they are a big player in the economic opportunities that are garnered in the sake of salmon. So.
Absolutely, Michelle, if I could just really quickly comment on that. That's such an excellent question. That part of the provincial wild salmon strategy is indeed working with other ministries like forestry, like mining, like agriculture, our own, my ministry. So that is absolutely critically important that we work across ministries, integrated together on the education of wild salmon habitat, and knowing authorizations which connect to that habitat are critical. So you bring up a great point.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we have a few more questions and we have about a minute and a half. So how are Indigenous peoples from the spawning grounds being consulted on agreements between industry and local Indigenous peoples whose territory the farm sits in?
In terms of, I think that's a salmon farm question. Yeah. So I think that's the federal government is going to be focused on that, but I think we need to develop a Broughton 2.0 style agreement, which ideally would be the federal government, the province, industry, and First Nations. Obviously, it's rights and title holders, and then others that are involved. So that's what I'd like to see, is us develop that, what I'm calling a Broughton 2.0 before June of 2022.
Awesome. That's an ambitious goal. All right, we got time for one more. Mr. Donnelly, how would a BC Interior band approach your fisheries ministry for support on Pacific salmon closed containment project development? That's coming from Dean Claxton, Nuchatlaht Salmon Advisor.
Dean, that's a great question. Just please call me, reach out to me directly. That is something I'm engaged with right now. The province has hired a consultant to do what I'm calling a RAS, a case for RAS in BC, so land-based containment. Please reach out to me directly, and I'd be happy to follow up with you. I'd be very interested to hear your proposal.
Awesome, thank you. And Maxine, I think the same would apply to you. Reach out to Finn directly, and he will help you out. Awesome, thanks. Thank you, everyone. That's for all your questions, and thank you, Finn, for an interesting discussion. We will now hear the update on Pacific Salmon Strategy with Executive Head of Pacific Salmon Strategy Transformation, Wes Shoemaker, and Senior Director of the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, Sarah Murdoch. Please go ahead, Sarah and Wes.
Hi, Michelle, and welcome, everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation. I'm going to kick off, and you're going to have a bit of a Sarah West show, if that works for folks, for the next few minutes. But I want to start by just acknowledging that I'm coming to you today from the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. And I'm hopefully a bit of a familiar face to some. I was appointed by our Deputy Minister back earlier this calendar year in this new exciting role, but I feel like I come well placed in the work I've done previously, whether it's launching BC Shrift and some of the big bar landslide response, or kicking off our first 5-year implementation plan for the wild salmon policy. Or some folks may know me also from the work I did for 7 years leading our Indigenous programs like AFS and AROM. That's myself. I'm gonna pass it over to Wes to introduce him. He's the new senior executive lead, as you mentioned, Michelle, on this file, and I'm sure that's of interest to people.
Good afternoon, everybody. I too would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of the Isangis and Esquimalt First Nations. And as Sarah mentioned, I am the executive head of the Pacific Salmon Strategy Transformation. Relatively new to my role. Many of you, I may have worked with many of you in my previous senior roles with the province as Deputy Minister of Agriculture, Food and Fish, Public Safety and Environment. However, why don't I now pass it back to Sarah? We'll kick off with our presentation, as I know time is limited, and more importantly, get to your questions at the end. So Sarah, back to you.
Great, thanks. If we can advance maybe to the next slide. I just want to spend a couple of minutes giving people a bit of a sense of the kind of the science foundation and what's the call to action that's led to this generational investment federally under the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative. And what you see here is basically a summary of what our scientists have been telling us, our science branch, regarding the fact that what we're seeing across the region, BC and also up in Yukon, is that our salmon populations are being negatively affected at every single stage of their life cycle. So the freshwater, the coastal, and the high seas or the marine environment. And there's, as many folks may remember from the Cohen Commission of Inquiry, there is no single smoking gun or rationale for why we're seeing these declines. But it is possible to sort of highlight the big six, as I call them. The biggest one, of course, and very timely today is this idea of climate change and warming waters. That has a huge impact on our salmon and salmon ecosystems, obviously. But it also leads to some of the big acute one-time events we've been seeing. So big bar landslide, many of you are aware of it and even involved with that ongoing response there. But we're seeing more forest fires, we're seeing more floods, all that impact our salmon habitat and ecosystems. There's also man-made or human-made impacts that we need to and maybe have more influence over going forward. And it was very positive to hear the words of Finn Donnelly in that regard, particularly around habitat degradation, land and water use pressures, pollution and cumulative effects. And something we're growing more and more interested in looking at is what's happening on the high seas in terms of what's called illegal and unregulated fishing. So that's the broader context for what PSSI is about. And if we can move to the next slide, I'll just hearken to sort of just really, I guess, one of the key points Wes and I want to make is that PSSI represents the department and the federal government looking for a very different approach to how we look at salmon and salmon management. And the call to action is here, obviously. We look across the 5 salmon species down below, and we've obviously known coho has been in trouble for some time up and down the coast. But what is really alarming over the last few years is what we're seeing in terms of the trends around Chinook and sockeye, and even in some key chum populations. So what our science folks has put together this table, and you look at from up in the north in the Yukon all the way down through southern BC to the mouth of the Fraser, we're seeing increasingly downward trends in all of our science information around assessment of those stocks. And one indicator of how things are doing, of course, is to look at salmon catch on the right-hand side. And you'll see that we've sort of been going on an up and down basis downwards since the early 90s, really, or early 2000s. But this chart only takes you to 2018, and you can see we sort of basically have crashed in terms of available catch. And so PSSI, or the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, is really a call to action based on what we're seeing here. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Wes to walk you through a little bit about the overview of the PSSI.
We have the next slide, please. Just in terms of brief history, in January of this year, the Prime Minister asked our then Minister Bernadette Jordan, to bring forward a new Pacific salmon strategy that was to be developed with partners, but one that looked at not only the conservation and protection of salmon, but habitat and ecosystems themselves. And so with that direction, the minister then officially launched what we are calling a PSSI in early June, based on 4 key pillars, which line up with what many refer to as the 3 H's, the habitat, the hatcheries, and harvest, plus a new 4th pillar focused on better integration and collaboration, not only within DFO, but more effective collaboration with key partners, including, but not limited to, First Nations and key First Nations fisheries organizations such as the FNFC. Next slide, please. So far, we have established some overarching key principles that include the fact that we see PSSI as a means to further and strengthen our positive relationships and collaboration with many BC First Nations, and to advance reconciliation in a practical and meaningful way. It will also mean for DFO being willing to push ourselves outside of our normal way of working, be more innovative, more focused on key priorities, and less of a black box to those we work alongside with, such as yourself. Next slide, please. Before I wrap up my brief overview and we can move into the discussion, it's important to note that we've already moved forward with an important initiative under the 3rd Harvest Transformation Pillar, and that was the extensive 2021 conservation closures introduced at the start of the past commercial fishing season, as well as with an intent to implement more long-term closures going forward. So I just want to acknowledge that while this was an important move, it's just one component of one pillar with what we are intending to be a very broad, multi-pronged approach to protecting our salmon for future generations. We know it had significant impact on commercial fishers and communities that depend on commercial fishing. And however, the intent was to reduce the impact of the commercial fishery on stocks of conservation concern and allow more salmon to reach spawning grounds. We announced plans for new programming to mitigate the impacts to harvesters. So obviously we're going to need to look at the impact to a broader group of harvesters, such as the rec sector. And we do see that as a key piece of the work to come under PSSI. Back to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Wes. So if we can move to the next slide, we want to just briefly talk about where to from here. Basically from May till now, we've just been having really early conversations. Some of you may have been involved with those around how do we best work together on this important work in going forward in a good way. And what is the top of mind kind of in terms of your key concerns or key priorities or opportunities that you think need to inherently be part of PSSI from the outset? So we sent initial letters out to all First Nations across BC and Yukon because we know how inherently important salmon is to pretty much all First Nations across British Columbia. And we also had, many of you were part of it, about 35 follow-up meetings. Most of those were done at the watershed scale. So we've appreciate the thanks of hosted fisheries organizations like the UFFCA, the Nuchatlaht, and some treaty nations also supported or hosted conversations, what we called in our early launch engagement. What we're now hoping to focus on, though, again, is establishing some of those new ways of working together that aren't focused specifically or solely on harvesting or allocation decisions, as have been the focus of many conversations today. But really, we need to look at how do we work together to restore and rebuild key salmon populations and key stocks. What are some of those key priorities that we need to work on and move quickly and together under each of those 4 pillars? And so that is some of the key area where we're hoping, if not today, very shortly to get into some conversations around that. If we can move to the next slide. Oh, maybe go back. Sorry, I thought we had one more. I did want to highlight here, and I guess this is in our last couple of points here, is that in many ways, the making progress on salmon and rebuilding and restoring salmon populations is going to have to involve boots on the ground and be very specific to what's happening in your local streams, rivers, and systems. But we really think an important first step in PSSI is going to be work done together at the regional scale. One thing that we learned from the Big Bar Land response is that we can come together quickly when there's an emergency on a bilateral and even trilateral basis, and that we don't need to spend months or even years building complex terms of reference. And we think responding to Pacific salmon declines really warrants a similar approach. But no doubt, and I think one point Wes and I are trying to make is that this is a commitment on from the department on a transformative approach. And we think we need to start that by looking at what are some of the regulatory policy and program shifts that we need to make at a regional scale to get us off on good footing. And so at the end of the day, we know that restoration, monitoring, rebuilding work, as I said, happens often at the local or watershed level. But we do want to talk about what would be the appropriate governance, the appropriate conversations to have around some fundamental new ways of working and managing salmon across Pacific region with you going forward. And we're hoping that we can be kicking off some of those conversations. And I think FNFC is open to being a bit of a convener for that in the coming weeks and months. So I think that is it. We can move to the next slide, and I'm going to pass it back to Wes just to wrap up before, Michelle, we invite you to field us some questions.
Thanks, Sarah, and I will wrap up. So in summary, I just want to highlight a couple of points. First of all, while Pacific salmon has a regional focus, for the department and the federal government, this is an initiative of national importance. And as such, why I am reporting directly to the Deputy Minister. And I guess this being a national priority is even more underscored by the fact that we now have a new BC, Western Canadian minister. So I'm really excited, though, to be part of this initiative. I was fortunate to have worked with a lot of the staff at DFO in my previous role. And so I'd like to think that I bring the perspective of an outsider to the department. Again, I give credit to the department for being bold enough to take on some of these transformational initiatives, to bring somebody like myself on who is very skilled at asking the dumb questions, and but more importantly, maybe working with others to get things done a bit differently. And again, that's my marching orders, are to break down the silos, not only the way we work internally in the department, but as well as how we work with our external partners that successfully transform the work that we will all do collectively together to rebuild our salmon stocks. And maybe one final point, and it is this: the PSSI is not about a quick fix. We all know that this is going to take a long-term, sustained effort, and because of the fact that salmon populations have varying life cycles from 3 to 5 years, that we probably are not going to realize the results of our efforts until 2 to 3 cycles out there. So while there's a focus on transformation in the short term, there is a commitment to endure for the long term, to do the things necessary to rebuild our salmon population. So thank you very much for your time today and to listening to our update. We have lots of work to do together, but I am confident that we can be successful when we come together as a group. Thank you, Michelle. Back to you.
Thank you, both Sarah and Wes. We're now ready to take some questions, and I like your commitment to the long term. We know things will survive if they reach 4 cycles. So unlike normal governments where they think in election cycles, we need to think about in generational cycles for our fish. So I'm glad to hear that's being implemented. I have a question that was held over from yesterday from Brian Asu. Rebecca deferred his question yesterday. He asked how much of the 647 million is allocated to commercial license retirement. Is there a fleet reduction target by gear type plan for FOC, and when is the program going to commence?
I think if it's all right, Wes, I can kick off.
Go ahead.
Really good question. And I would say, I'm not going to give maybe the full satisfactory answer, but I am happy, Brian, for us to make sure we follow up in future. I will say that we did launch, as Wes mentioned, plans for a new program called the Pacific Salmon Commercial Transformation Program. That was announced at the end of June, but it's still very much in development. There's still many more consultations needed with all types of harvest sector, commercial salmon harvesters over the winter before we formally launch in the spring. And so at this point, we can't say how much money we're going to necessarily dedicate to that core program, because it's going to be voluntary and application based, what the pickup will be. I have heard, some folks think we need to target 2/3 of the fishery. I think one thing we will say is that we certainly know it needs to be open and eligible to all fishers from all gear types. And I can also say that we're committed to giving a fair value for those commercial salmon licenses. But at this point, it's a bit premature to say how much the total program will cost. We still need to consult with those who are going to be impacted in order to finish the design work.
All right. Are you going to respond, Wes? Are you good with that?
I'm sorry for the heavy sigh there, Michelle, but I'll take that as a cue, maybe just to add a finer point to that is one of the awkward spots we're in right now is just coming out of the election with a new minister. We still need to go through our authorities to, although money has been committed to get, and everybody will get the processes that we need to go through to actually access the dollars. But I also want it to be understood that, a lot of this is not fully baked. While maybe the direction of travel, if I can use this metaphor, has been set, that, how fast we travel in a lane and, where our position in the lane, if I can use that metaphor, is still things that we want to work with stakeholders in determining. So we've got a lot back to the commercial closures. We still have a lot of work yet to do to, again, with a voluntary program, just to figure out what that looks like and how best to move forward. So thanks, Michelle.
And I know Minister Murray is very familiar with fisheries on the West Coast here and also money. So I am sure it won't take much to get her up to speed. And I'm pretty excited by the fact that she's from the West Coast. So I've got Greg here has a question. How will Indigenous people participate in the collaborative decision-making processes regarding where the PSSI fund spending is focused? Will PSSI create an Indigenous-led secretariat to assist in identifying priorities for the strategy?
Maybe I can kick off
Sarah,
and I'll leave you.
That one?
Yeah, sure. I would say, right now for the remainder of this fiscal year, so from now till April, we really want to work with yourselves, hopefully through the FNFC and processes we're talking to them about putting in place for some important tier 2 discussion, really to find out how you would like and how we would together like to have the capacity to work out that plan. We don't have a prescriptive approach for figuring out how best to do this, whether it's an Indigenous secretariat or not. We do know, though, that we need to support you through capacity funding in order to support us. We do want to know what First Nations priorities are, at an aggregate scale, at a regional-wide scale, particularly, as I mentioned in the presentation, because we think we have some major issues to tackle together around at the regulatory policy scale that are probably provincial in nature. And best done, but we need to create that process to do that. And we certainly are committed to doing that on a bilateral basis with First Nations. We also want to obviously have spaces, and I think there is interest in potentially some kind of ongoing advisory multi-party process as well for the minister to hear about restoration and rebuilding priorities. But our first step, and what we'd like to speak most quickly about, is how best to engage you all and build that structure to work together. As you said, Michelle, over the long haul, we are wanting to build something that will carry us through this important work. So invest in that now.
Thank you. So next question, I'm just going to rattle through them. Why did the introduction of the PSSI only include commercial fishery reductions and closures and not recreational reductions? This approach continued to demonstrate the DFO and the minister are protecting the recreational priority. From Murray Ned.
Okay, I'll take a kick at that. So we needed to take immediate action on especially those populations that, presented the greatest conservation threat. And again, in some of those areas, it was the commercial sector that presented the greatest risk at that moment in time. However, on a going forward basis, especially with regards to the transformational pieces in under the harvest pillar. Not only will it look at transformations in the commercial sector, but so too will it include the recreational sector, and also, just looking at what transformations need to happen with regards to indigenous opportunities as well. It also is rooted in revisiting our salmon allocation policy, which is part and parcel of the PSSI, and then really trying to take a very, very, as I said before, a very broad and integrated approach, multi-pronged approach at how we, are on the one hand meeting our conservation and protective goals, but are there new ways that we can provide, more targeted and increased harvest opportunities across all of the sectors? And I think every sector has a role to play, and every sector will be touched by the initiative. But I take it that one of the first and early moves we made was those commercial closures, and just to say that isn't going to be the end of it. There's much more yet to come.
Thank you. All right. How do you envision the implementation of the fourth pillar under the Pacific Salmon Strategic Initiative, integrated management and collaboration? What role will BC First Nations play in the development and application of this pillar?
Maybe I can give it a quick stab, Wes, if that's good, and you can feel that free to add. But this pillar, as I think we mentioned, and the author here picks up on, really has two key components. There's an internal one and an external one. The integration part is really internal to the department, and I heard this from many First Nations when we did our first round of engagement, that it's the siloing of our work now through various programs that's part of the problem, a big part of the problem, in terms of we're not being coherent, we're not being strategic, we're not moving forward in an effective way. And so that is a key kind of first piece, and I'll be leading what we're calling the Pacific Salmon Strategy Secretariat, with the key function of bringing that integration and coherence across what we do. But with respect to collaboration externally, we also want to be a much more effective partner with First Nations, the BC government, others. And we know, and we're here to acknowledge that we can't deliver on the goals and objectives of PSSI alone. And we don't even have the mandate necessarily within the federal government and within DFO to do everything we think is possible to bring back our salmon population. So regarding First Nations specifically, again, this is something that we want to work out with yourselves. How do we be a better partner? What does that look like? What is your role? What is our role? And how do we work together? I think that's going to be a key area for this, what we're calling early implementation engagement that we're hoping to kickstart next month. Thanks, Michelle.
Excellent. So I have about 2 more questions in the time we have left. What percentage of PSSI will be used by DFO for projects like monitoring or license buyback? i.e., DFO has used pick fee for such projects in the past.
Oh boy, Sarah, this might require me to do some quick math on the top of my head, which I'm probably going to do a poor job of doing that. I mean, a portion of PSSI is going to be associated with monitoring and license buyback, but there's a significant amount of money that is also allocated towards, just transformation in so many different initiatives. So actually, regulatory or licensing regimes, how we come at habitat restoration, how we bring more science and data to the table. So I would like to say that I don't think we're doubling down, except for BC SRIF, but doubling down on any particular area. We're just trying to make targeted and appropriate investments in so many different areas of the strategy so that we can have our maximum and best effect. But our ability to monitor, and I know there's lots of data out there right now, but our ability to even use data more effectively to help us better understand, what is the status of certain populations, but more importantly, how does that data and the science inform some of the science-based decisions, is an area where we need to be even more stronger on.
All right, I have about 30 seconds, but I know Andy Olson has 3 questions here. Each are strategically important for different reasons, but I understand from this very one question where this has truly a full circle impact on how DFO has structured itself in the past to impact the individual First Nations fishers. What about those fishers that lease licenses from communities that have nothing to sell or retire? How will they be helped? And this is a direct result out of different policy programs over the years. So, Sarah.
I think I'll take this one if I can run the clock a little bit over. I'll just say, I mentioned, we want to kickstart broader PSSI-wide consultations or collaborative engagement sessions in the coming months. In addition to that, the key initiatives as they roll out are going to have their own need for whether it's working groups or different groups of people to come together and advise. There is a commitment from our my fisheries management colleagues to come out and consult and engage more directly on the fisheries closures going forward. And one of the key areas, though, is this idea of what about commercial access, or I'm not sure, Andy, you might be getting at the FNFC licenses. We recognize that over 40% of the commercial salmon fishery right now is done through communal access, and that license transition program I mentioned is not going to apply there. Those aren't individual license holders. So yes, it's definitely needs to be part of the program design right from the beginning. And I can pass you, if you want to reach out to me, I'll pass you on the name of, I think they've just brought on Strength, the lead who's going to be helping with those consultations over the coming months. So I can pass it on to you, Andy. Thanks.
Thank you both. This is all the time we have for questions now. Please take a moment to participate in our survey. We'd like to hear from you. I want to thank both of you again for sharing today. It's exciting to see some of the twists and turns that DFO's been taking and making under these last iterations of government. So thank you for that. Of the 4 PSSI pillars, where do you think investment should focus on? Integrated management and collaboration, conservation and stewardship, enhanced hatchery production, harvest transformation. The Slido polling is open right now. Oh, wow. And it's that quick. So I'll just give you a minute to finish off entering your answers. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. We'll now take a break and reconvene at 3 o'clock for a presentation on the Ahousaht et al. Decision with Elder and Lead Negotiator Wickaninnish Chief Cliff Atleo. Sorry. See you in a few minutes. We're now going to hear a recorded presentation by Lead Negotiator for Ahousaht First Nation, Wickaninnish Cliff Atleo, about the Ahousaht et al. Decision and what it means for First Nations in British Columbia. Afterwards, Cliff will join us live to answer your questions.
Good afternoon, First Nations Fisheries Council. Cliff Atleo, Wickaninnish from Ahousaht, speaking to you from Muchalaht territory, providing a brief summary of talks with Canada that have been ongoing for, it seems like forever, but we won the case in November 2009. We began talks with them in 2010. In 2017, after the election and cabinet members, we chose to work with CERNAC and DFO to create a term sheet in order to secure a mandate from cabinet to move forward with the implementation of our court win. And what we didn't realize in the development of that term sheet was that government officials always provide 3 options for cabinet to consider. And so the only option we were aware of is the one that we worked with CERNAC and DFO to develop. We were not aware of the other two options that were presented. And clearly parts of the other two elements were adopted because there were some elements in our term sheet that were not considered or adopted as recommended. And but generally they favored most of what was provided in a term sheet. And we secured that in May of 2019, 2 years after. It seemed to take forever from the time we developed the term sheet to presentation to cabinet, and eventually getting cabinet to decide on a mandate to move forward. And until COVID, we had been meeting with Canada representatives bi-monthly, and we're making measured progress. And I use that term rather loosely because there hasn't been a lot of progress, generally speaking, since 2010. So since COVID, March 2020, negotiations have been very slow and limited to short teleconferences every 2 weeks. You know, sometimes an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, sometimes 3.5 hours. Whereas before, when we were meeting in person, we would definitely schedule 2 full days. So there was quite a departure from what we were doing before COVID and what we were doing after COVID. And COVID was a big excuse, and Zoom was a big excuse. All of a sudden, Zoom fatigue was hanging around everybody, and except for us. It never seemed to bother me, and I don't know why people talk about Zoom fatigue. We have met in mid-September to prepare for our next engagement, which we thought would be in November sometime. Now that's uncertain given the time frame the Prime Minister has given in terms of the cabinet announcement and all those other things that come with setting up government and governance. So the bulk of the outstanding issues are related to a side agreement that's going to be called the Community-Based Economic Fisheries Schedule, the part of the agreement that will provide guidance on how the fisheries are developed, implemented, and evaluated. We have set up a Haum board of, we call it the board Haum, and they will be the implementers of agreements that we come to with Canada. Key areas that are still outstanding include appropriate levels of monitoring and what economic viability means in the context of the fisheries. And from our point of view, economic viability actually is not going to be possible without actually securing what we've put on the table formally to Canada is 50% of available catch of all species. And we are in the process of sitting down with your organization, with BCAFN and the National AFN and the Union of Chiefs and the Summit here in British Columbia to get everybody on board and on the same page, because it's ridiculous that we allow the government of Canada to fight against our people to be participating in an economy that allows us to be self-sustaining communities and families. They spent $19.1 million fighting against us to exercise an inherent right, in my view. The backstop, in terms of what we call the backstop, was securing access. The government has offered us $65 million to secure access. And 8 months after they tabled that offer, they suddenly realized that they need to tell us that, oh, by the way, 35 million of that 65 million is for you to buy more FSP sea. And we just could not believe that Canada could be so blatant in terms of their attitude toward our people that we have to buy FSC. I don't think so. Anyway, they know formally that we're opposed to that and that we'd like to utilize, if the only means of securing access is to buy, and that really wasn't our preference when we developed the term sheet. Our preference was Minister allocates to the sporties and commercials without this movement of dollars between people. We said, Minister, use your discretion and allocate us without having to buy out existing access. Anyway, the fourth outstanding issue is the court defined 9 nautical miles. I won't go into how ridiculous that is, but it's not viable at all for us to stick within the court-defined area of 9 nautical miles. That was taken out of a book of a slave of McQuina, who estimated that halibut banks offshore were 9 nautical miles. And the good judge said, there's a good idea. We'll keep them within the 9 nautical mile boundary. Anyway, we've been opposed to that from the time they announced it. Once complete and supported by the Ahousaht, it'll be expected the Ahousaht Society Board and the Ahousaht staff carry out and implement the agreements. Part of our work now is also to set up a trust fund for the dollars to be handled by Ahousaht, and lead negotiators provided direction in 2021 February to start involving legal counsel in the review of documents to ensure that documents do not limit, negate, or negatively impact the Aboriginal right now or into the future. So it's been quite helpful to actually have legal counsel participating at appropriate times in our deliberations in prepping to meet with Canada. We met in September, and we also prepared a legal strategy, and we prepared for re-engaging with Canada. Our focus was on needing to have a multi-pronged approach and not relying on a negotiation as the only route. And parts of that were evident this summer when the government gave us have always given us such a minuscule allocation for Chinook fisheries, and we created our own plan and said, we're going to fish beyond the small allocation that we've got. And ours will be sanctioned by our Ahousaht, developed professionally by our biologists and our staff. And so we've done that. And we'll be doing that with other species as well. We're renewing our fishing plans for 2022 that will be endorsed by our Ahousaht and to be implemented by Ahousaht. And we'll set our allocations based on economic viability and abundance in the territory. We are working with Ratcliff on a renewed legal strategy if Canada continues to stonewall our people and prevent us from exercising our right. And I think it's time that our people, Indigenous people, not only provincially but nationally, stood up together and said right to Canada that they need to quit fighting against our people's desire to be involved in the economic activity of their lands, of their territories, and of their resources. So that's what we're initiating in terms of the 50%. I think it'll be a lot cheaper if Canada would just agree with us, if we could successfully secure that. And so it's going to be important for your organization to seriously consider this proposal by the Five Nations. And, you know, a little background with that is when we won the court case, our head chief announced to all of Nuchatlaht that every Nuchatlaht nation is in this canoe. No one is going to be left ashore. And our view is that in terms of Canada's fighting against the Indigenous people, that needs to stop and allow our people to coexist with the newcomers in a way that would allow us to be self-sustaining, healthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wickaninish, and I can't wait to have this Q&A with you as we see the questions that are lining up. So we've just got a few seconds between the switchover between the live feed and the video feed, and we'll be ready to start our Q&A with Wickaninish. So give yourself a little bit of a stretch, and I think we're about 30 seconds away. We're back. Please welcome Cliff. And you can now use the Slido box to submit your questions in the Slido. So we have a few questions already. And Cliff, I'm just going to start asking you the questions. How are you? I hear you're sitting with.
Thank you.
I hear you're sitting with my good friend Mike Watts. Are you? Okay, good. Just checking. Can you describe how the Ahousaht decision relates to First Nations rights to self-determination, including the right to freely pursue their economic, political, and social and cultural development?
Well, you know, one of our big challenges is the newcomers don't really understand how we were before they arrived. And they have no appreciation whatsoever of our people actually helping them to survive when they arrived, and actually helping them with their economies, of showing them where the fish are and all the other aquatic species. And, you know, our people going through colonialism and their acts, and people who kept their diaries said, I noticed that the First Nations are highly dependent on the ocean resources. If we cut that off, then we defeat them. They actually wrote that in a diary of one of the newcomers. And so along with that was the acts that came along that prevented us from commercially fishing. That was very much a part of the advice lawmakers were given. And all of it seemed to be very much about defeating us and getting rid of us and doing away with us so they can exploit the resources that were rich. You know, our people were rich. Our people were great managers. And there's no doubt about that. And we don't get any recognition for how good things were. Now, we just finished hearing a presentation on the Pacific Salmon Initiative. And it's pathetic. And so what we're talking about and have been fighting for, a way of life, is so that we can stand on our own feet, so we can be independent. And, you know, I speak from experience when I talk about how good it was. Even myself as a teenager, we didn't need any government assistance for anything. We wanted for zero from the government, not even housing. And we didn't have housing shortages. We built our own homes because we could. And so, you know, I like to tell a story in terms of self-government, that our hereditary system was very much active when I was growing up in Ahousaht. And I remember one of the speakers for one of our chiefs said, don't you pay $1 for that license. He was an orator, and by gosh, he could deliver his message loud and clear. He warned our guys, don't pay for that license. It only costs $1, but don't pay it. Why? Because we have an inherent right. We don't need to pay $1 to be participating in a resource that has provided for us, not only for a couple hundred years, but thousands of years. And so we're fighting to reestablish a way of life that looked after our people, that didn't know about homelessness, that didn't know about hungry, and that the more the chiefs gave away, the richer they were. And so we're trying to reestablish that and convince the government that there is an opportunity for a change to do the right thing. They don't know how to do that as government. They don't know how to do that, and we need to be there to help them.
Jude? So this year, the Council of Ahousaht authorized Nuchatlaht fishers under their own license to fish halibut. Can you describe how the Council of Ahousaht came to this decision, the political and technical considerations, and the outcomes?
Yeah, our table is called Ahousaht, and Ahousaht is an actual instrument in the Hopiquanum of Ahousaht. Hopiquanum is like our Constitution, only it's better than the Canadian Constitution by far. It has everything in there for a hereditary chief to govern. And that Ahousaht is an actual carving that's about that big. That is the licensing scheme that the hereditary chiefs had for anyone that wanted to harvest anything out of his territory. And so, we got tired of waiting for the government to actually wake up to reconciliation, to wake up to what inherent right actually means to our people. And so we've embarked on this path that's designed to actually fish to our plans. And we have knowledgeable people that work for us that can be very effectively create plans on behalf of the hereditary chiefs and ignore the minuscule allocations being provided by the government. What the government is providing us is designed to keep us down and to keep us poor and to keep providing for everybody else that has a privilege, not a right, a privilege. Commercial guys have a privilege. Recreational guys have a privilege. We have an inherent right. And by gosh, that's got to carry some weight. And we need to convince the government that it's time they did the right thing. And that's why this sharing approach that we're proposing makes a lot of sense and will actually provide us an opportunity at least to have a chance for self-sustainability for health of children and families and communities.
I have a question from Anonymous. Might the Ahousaht decision be applicable to Indigenous peoples throughout BC and Canada?
Definitely, because this message that we're carrying about convincing Canada not to keep fighting Indigenous people, to keep them down, that policy applies nationally. And the Mi'kmaq is a prime example. They have a treaty that was designed for peace and friendship. They gave nothing up. Peace and friendship is what the treaty said. And that's why they won the court case in the Supreme Court, the late Marshall decision. But even that decision is a racist decision because it says, because you're Mi'kmaq, you can only make a moderate living. Now, if we aren't aware of systemic racism, examining some of the decisions that even come in our favor, clearly are racist. So I think that our decision, if we promote the idea of Canada not fighting Indigenous people, but agree nationally to provide half of all aquatic resources for Indigenous people, that by gosh, we'll be doing step number one for reconciliation.
Awesome. Okay, I got time for a couple questions. In your opinion, what are some of the key components for First Nations across Turtle Island to successfully come together and come up with a united message?
I'm having a hard time reading the question. I think that there's no doubt about the enormity of the challenge of getting everybody on the right page. But I think that there's a lot of evidence around that the governments actually fight to keep us down. They fight to keep us out of the economic equation. And, right now, a lot of their words like reconciliation and stuff ring hollow simply because there's real no action toward that reconciliation. And they have no comprehension whatsoever of what real reconciliation is. Reconciliation to me says we start moving toward rebuilding a foundation that allowed our people to be independent people and not dependent on anyone else, but allows us to look after our people, whether they're home or away. And so we got a long ways to go, but I think that it's so important to have Indigenous people on the same page with regards to telling the government that it's not right to fight against our involvement in economic activity for self-sustaining communities.
Okay. So Andy from NFA wants to know, what are the ways that he can support your fishers, help with sales and buying and things like that?
That's a good question because we actually are very keen about selling to our people that are interested in supporting our activity. Because in the end, there's not a nation in this country that wasn't dependent on some kind of trade. And it's silly for the newcomers to suggest that we should not be involved or participating. So, I think that the broader connections we can make in terms of opportunities to sell to other Indigenous people, we can get around the government actually threatening buyers. They threatened our buyers that were available to our people with a $250,000 fine if they touched our fish that was designed to go beyond the small allocations they provided us. And they skipped no one. And then they lied to our people and said, if you wanted to do a demonstration fishery, you should have asked us. Well, by gosh, for a week before we even went out fishing, they were threatening the buyers that they dared to touch our fish or buy it from our people, that they were going to be subject to a $250,000 fine.
Thanks, Wiccaninish. I know Geoduck was left out of the catch in the Ahousaht decision. Ken Malloway wants to know if you got anywhere on Geoducks.
Not yet, but as far as we're concerned, Geoduck has never been off the table.
Awesome.
So, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not going to start questioning the people that won our case, but it blows me away that we lost that argument. We have a name for Geoduck.
I know.
We have Indigenous people, not only in Nuchatlaht land, but in other nations who today harvest Geoduck. And, to me, we had strong arguments to win that case. But the system, how it works, we know how rich the Geoduckers are, and we know that they hired probably pretty slick lawyers to win the argument and allowed it to be pulled off the table. And when it's rich and lucrative like that, yeah, let's keep it out of the Indian hands. We don't want them to be successful.
Well, thanks, Wiccaninish, and thank you, everyone, for your questions. We'll now continue discussing legal matters in the context of cumulative effects. Recently, the Blueberry River First Nations case has broken new legal ground in this area. Please welcome Maegan Giltrow from the Legal Counsel of Ratcliff LLP, presenting on the significance of this case for First Nations. Maegan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. My apologies. Thank you. Thanks. I'm very glad to be here. I wish I could see everyone in person, but it's great to be here to speak about the Blueberry case. I was lead counsel in the case along with my team of colleagues from Ratcliff and Company for Blueberry. And I'm going to focus my remarks today, give an overview of the significant impacts of the case, the successful win from the BC Supreme Court. But I certainly have it prepared with an eye to lessons that can be taken from it and applied in the broader context, and obviously very mindful of the fisheries context we're discussing here. So I have quite a few slides prepared. I won't dwell on all of them, and I do want to leave time for questions. The quick overview: the Blueberry River First Nations case was one that we filed in 2015 based on the cumulative effects of development in the Treaty 8 territory, in particular the Blueberry River First Nations territory. We've been through many years of pretrial wrangling and 160 days of trial, and it resulted in a huge win for Blueberry June 29th of this year from the BC Supreme Court. And on about 1 month later, the BC government confirmed it will not be appealing the decision. So the decision I'm telling you about today is the last word on this, and it stands as important precedent for Section 35 rights, treaty rights, and cumulative impacts going forward. Next slide, please. I wanted to start just briefly by talking about the starting point of the case, because I think this will resonate for First Nations who are thinking about advancing and defending their rights more generally, which is obviously the starting point comes from the Indigenous experience and what we were told by our Donnelly clients up in the Northeast with respect to the devastating impacts of accumulating development in and around their reserve and the territories they traditionally relied upon, radiating out over the expanse of their traditional territory. And we were told that whole areas had gone dark in terms of having lost so much habitat or suffering so much pollution that they were essentially unusable. An inundation of referrals, consultation referrals, none of which ever went anywhere, no matter what Blueberry did. What we ended up proving in trial is, despite the thousands of pieces of correspondence that were sent back and forth, government did not once say no to forestry or oil and gas referrals or hydroelectric development in Blueberry's territory. And this was in the hundreds and thousands of permits a year. So nothing was working on the procedural or consultation scale. We needed to look at a substantive remedy. We were told very much, there's a broad range of experiences that the nation was troubled by. Elders were experiencing great concern about the future for the future generations. We heard these through stories, warnings issued across generations about, trails that were lost, examples, streams that they used to be able to rely upon for making tea, which meant you could travel out into the territory for weeks on end because you could survive off what the territory could provide. Hugely important opportunities for cultural transmission. Well, all of that was incrementally being lost because the pieces of the territory, including such things as clean water and the resources you'd expect to find in it, were being systematically diminished. We heard about the experience of being in the territory, the smells, the noise from industrial pollution, cabins, family cabins, traditional cabins built and then surrounded, encroached upon by all sides from development. So as mitigation measures, the cabins would be left standing, but they would be seriously encroached upon by the surrounding impacts of development and habitat destruction around them, and so made much less useful than they'd been. We heard about animal health, festers on animals when scarce moose were found. When they were opened up, they weren't fit for consumption. People counting their displacement in their territory in days that, it used to be a 2 or 3 day affair to be able to reliably get, for example, a moose in an area, and it was stretching out to 12, sometimes 19, 20 days with no success. So these are just examples, but when you're putting the case together, that's very much what forms the basis of it, and it's what formed the claim we brought forward. And the range of disturbances was huge. Next slide, please. The case that Blueberry brought forward was fundamentally, and this reflects back to what Cliff Atleo was just saying in terms of what the nations are fighting for with respect to the fisheries rights. Even though this is a treaty case, the fundamental measure was the same. It was fighting for a way of life. In this case, that was a way of life that we ultimately proved was promised to be protected through Treaty 8, that a fundamental promise of Treaty 8 was that the way of life that the Indigenous people, the signatories to the treaty in 1899 and 1900, that way of life would be protected, and there would be room for settlement, room for some element of settler society to move in, room for some development, but that the promise to protect the way of life was the fundamental promise of Treaty 8. And that's one of the really significant points of the decision, because it's very contrary to what the province of British Columbia argued at trial. BC argued that Treaty 8 was really only about not restricting hunting, trapping, and fishing, i.e., as long as you weren't stopped from hunting, no legal restrictions were put on it, the treaty was being honored. And BC went in very much on the position that they had not promised to protect a way of life, and that therefore no breach existed. And BC's argument was, in fact, that there would be no breach until no meaningful right remained, and which, taken to its logical extension, meant that it was all gone. And the BC Supreme Court fundamentally refuted that position, which is a very important legal point that's been established through the case. Next slide, please. And very importantly, and I think this matters a lot, and it harkens back to the trial decisions, especially the first trial decision in the Ahousaht case. But the Supreme Court recognition of what's required, in particular in this case, in terms of the treaty promise, what's required to protect the way of life. That in this case, the promise was that the Crown would not significantly affect or destroy the basic elements or features needed for the way of life to continue. And so we have a declaration essentially that requires a promise to maintain a healthy environment with ample wildlife, which is miles beyond where we were when we started this case. It was also a recognition of the need for freedom of movement throughout the land, which was very much brought to life by the testimony of the witnesses that appeared before the court. That it wasn't just about preserving one small area or two small areas or being confined within lines on a map, that a way of life truly lived through the Indigenous experience required redundancy of places to go to, the ability to let places live fallow, the freedom to move as culture, knowledge, and experience dictated, and that was being encroached upon through successive development. Next slide, please. The three main evidentiary pillars of the case, we built the case based on, first, the testimony of the Blueberry members. They were the ones in the best position to describe their way of life. Many of these losses have been felt most acutely within the last 20 years. So we had members of all ages testify to their experience of way of life, but then very importantly, their experience of loss of the way of life, the experience of diminishment. And that really was the primary evidence. It was, of course, buttressed by a lot of wildlife science, expert evidence in the government's own documents about wildlife health and populations. And then very importantly, especially perhaps for land-based cumulative effects claims, through disturbance data that was very much government data. We had long arguments about the admissibility of this data, and important precedent was set by getting this data in and having it found reliable by the court. But a lot of evidence about the range of disturbance from forestry, oil and gas, roads, seismic lines, hydroelectric, agriculture, urban, all consolidated to give us quantitative assessments of the range of the disturbances that have been felt on the land. Next slide, please. So we had, this gives a sense of the types of experiences that we led evidence on in terms of the many experiences of diminishment. So to way of life, to wildlife, the ability to hunt, forest, all of the things that I've mentioned, including prohibition from the feeling of being excluded because of private land. So even if there weren't strict legal exclusions, the court gave great weight to members recounting their experiences of being told to get off private land and that they weren't allowed to hunt there. And that was one of the examples of the contributory infringements that amounted to the unjustified infringement the court found ultimately. Next slide, please. We used a lot of images. We had to, one of our tasks, and this will be a task for any nation bringing these sorts of questions about when the thing you're fighting to protect by going to court is way of life, there's the complex task of conveying way of life and the experience of living that life and feeling the diminishment of it to the court. So through words, we did this, and then we relied a lot on images too. We had a lot of helicopter, ground shot, and drone images before the court to try to translate from, out there into the very confined experience of the courtroom. Next slide, please. We produced an atlas of landscape disturbance, which quantified disturbance in a lot of ways, and including demonstrating that, by 2016, 73% of Blueberry's territory was within 250 meters of disturbance. And we had other evidence showing that by 2018, 91% of the territory was within 500 meters. And BC, the defendant fought hard against the admissibility or reliability of these numbers, but the court held that they were very admissible and very reliable, mostly because it came from the government's own data, and that these went far beyond what could have been contemplated by those who negotiated the treaty in 1900 in terms of the fundamental promise to preserve the way of life. Next slide, please. We had other visual representations. Also, the atlas is replete with graphs and tables and maps and conveying it in every which way. I guess I'd say we erred on the side of redundancy in terms of coming at conveying the reality that the Indigenous people were facing through many different angles. And this is one example that this map has been reproduced a number of times. But this gives a sense of the scale and layout of the cumulative changes within Blueberry's territory. Next slide, please. And I would say some of the key findings that I think translate in terms of analogously to fishing experiences is that the court measured infringement by measuring the loss as described by the plaintiffs, as opposed to accepting the province's theory of the case, which is that if you counted up from nothing, that is, if you could show that some Blueberry members got some moose within the last few years, i.e., you couldn't say there was nothing left. that was sort of the Crown's theory we put forward. Our approach was to say, well, let's look at what the way of life is, and then let's listen to how much has been lost. And we say that amounts to infringement. And the court really did go with that and did it by listening to what had changed for the Indigenous people, that they couldn't exercise their rights in their preferred areas. They had to travel farther and farther just to see signs of wildlife. The fragmentation, pollution, areas disappeared. Wildlife, when they found them, were less abundant or healthy. No peaceful enjoyment left in significant areas, not feeling safe or welcome. So that was given primacy, and then it was buttressed by the scientific evidence. And I think that that's an important approach that the court has taken, and one that I hope will be emulated in other cases. Next slide, please. I won't get into the details of this one, but one of the key findings there, this was where the Crown was both arguing that the area Blueberry was claiming was both too big and too small, i.e. too big that Blueberry would have control over too much territory if it got its remedy, but it was too small because why didn't they just go outside their territory to hunt and fish? And we were dealing with both at once. And the court rejected those approaches. But importantly, the court recognized that what needs to be there, what was promised when the way of life was promised to be protected, was the relative stability, of the environment, and that patterns of use would be repeatable into the future. And that there would be a reasonable return on effort, that with the knowledge Indigenous people bring to the areas that they've known for generations, they are entitled to a reasonable return on their effort. It's not a guarantee of success when you hunt or fish or trap, but that it is a reasonable return on effort, and that requires a relatively stable environment. And the court also recognized that all of this is fundamentally in essence of in service of the rights to maintain a culture and identity, which gets us back to the core purpose of Section 35, which of course translates well beyond treaty rights. Next slide, please. Another factor I really want to point out that the Blueberry case, the court in the Blueberry case found was that, so there is breach. The court found that the Crown had allowed the development of land to go beyond what was contemplated in treaty, beyond any reasonable threshold, but very importantly found also that the Crown's management mechanisms failed, and failed in two ways. One, that fundamentally, the Crown had failed to put in place management mechanisms that would make good on the promise in the treaty, that would ensure that as development proceeded, it was doing so in a way that would ensure the safety of the way of life, the protection of the way of life, essentially cumulative impacts. Management regime should have been put in place long ago. And the court also found that the Crown's existing management regimes, which the Crown said were managing cumulative impacts, the court found first, no, they weren't. And second, that in fact, the Crown's management regimes had contributed to the breach. It was the very management regimes that the Crown said were sufficient that had actually led to the cumulative impacts crisis that was brought before the court. And the court had some pretty strong language in terms of the persistent problem of within government, one decision maker always pointing to another decision maker as being the ones who were really in charge of cumulative effects. That mitigation alone was not a management mechanism. In fact, it contributed to the change because it allowed the accumulation of impacts. No permits were ever denied, and the persistent problem of delay was pointed out by the court many times. Next slide, please. So ultimately, we got 4 very important declarations that the province has breached the obligations under Treaty 8 by allowing so much development to happen, and that the province's management tools have contributed to the breach, that there are not sufficient and appropriate lands to allow for the meaningful exercise of the treaty rights, and therefore the province has unjustifiably infringed Blueberry's treaty rights. And very significantly, our 3rd declaration is that the province may not continue to authorize activities that breach the promises in the treaty or unjustifiably infringe the treaty rights, which is a very significant declaration with very significant implications that I'll tell you about in a moment. And that leads right into that the parties must act with diligence to establish timely, enforceable mechanisms to assess and manage cumulative impacts of development on these constitutional rights. Next slide, please. I want to highlight a couple of similarities to the Ahousaht, this year's BC Court of Appeal Ahousaht decision, because there's certain, with what the Annual Assembly is thinking about, these are similarities that are important. One is that the business as usual approach, or which is the words from the BC Supreme Court in Blueberry, or the refusal to move beyond the existing regulatory scheme, which is what the Court of Appeal in Ahousaht described as the basis for the failure of the negotiations leading up to the justification trial, that does not satisfy Section 35. So an intransigence by government to refuse to move outside the existing regulatory regime in both cases led to ultimate failures to meet the obligations in Section 35. This can't be business as usual, and both cases speak to that. Next slide, please. Another commonality that I would say, in both cases, the Crown tried really what I call the Commission of Inquiry defense. Well, I don't need to call it that. They really do call it that, where government says, well, look, these First Nations have brought these unwieldy, huge claims before the court, and they're asking you to look too deeply and too broadly into what's rightly the discretionary decisions of government. And court, this is not your job. This isn't a commission of an inquiry. And really, that defense isn't working. The courts have recognized, especially the Court of Appeal in Ahousaht, and certainly the BC Supreme Court in Blueberry, recognized that these Section 35 rights are broad, and they relate to a way of life, and government regulates them in broad ways. And the courts will look in detail into government regulation to see the impacts it is having on Section 35 rights. And in both cases, the court has found that the cumulative impacts of the regulatory regimes is leading to a breach of Section 35 rights. And in both cases resulting in declarations requiring a change from government. Next slide, please. I want to highlight too, in both cases, the huge importance of the testimony of the witnesses, the member witnesses, and the importance attributed to culture in measuring the right and measuring its infringement, and also in justification. I'm mindful of time, so I'll move to the next couple of slides. I've talked about remedy, so I can move past that. And just talk, this is my last slide, and this is really about what's next in terms of implementation of the Blueberry decision. We know that, as the court held, there is currently not sufficient or appropriate lands left in Blueberry's territory for them to meaningfully carry out their treaty rights. The court was, and the court has put a pause directed that the Crown can no longer issue permits that will further infringe those rights. It's hugely significant. The court was mindful, and this was something we put before the court, that this doesn't mean shutting out further development forever, that the treaty contemplated a balance. We've long lost that balance, but we can get back to it. And so, similar to the fisheries plans that the nations had and that were discussed with respect to the Ahousaht decision, we put before the court that Blueberry had a plan. Blueberry had built a land stewardship framework that outlined a process that would properly manage the land through protections and, what's often called ecosystem-based management. But there is a plan, but now we've got to get down to implementing it. And the words of one of our witnesses there, I'll just close with those. They're quoted by the court, and they're very powerful, and I think persuaded the court and gave the court comfort that if sent away to work in a collaborative way with government to properly manage the land, this could be achieved between Blueberry and the Crown. And that witness had said that for all her years working as lands manager, she said, I always had the perspective that if there was actual land management and planning done, that resource development could happen while maintaining and managing for treaty rights. I always had that idea in my mind. And when you look at the ecosystems and you place a value, for us, we place values on certain ecosystems, and we want those maintained. We want them to function. So that planning process is what Blueberry is embarking on with the province now, with the huge help of the court order, which reverses the onus and doesn't presume that development will continue apace. It's given us the space and time to get to the real work that Blueberry's been asking for a long time. So those are my slides. I'm happy to move into questions now.
Thank you, Maegan. We'll open the floor to questions. Please use your Slido box to enter your question. I want to thank you, and I want to bring back the thoughts of the salmon parks. They seem to have the same kind of application that you're going to be using in the Blueberry decision. So it's exciting to see that everybody is now looking at land management in a holistic way and being able to express that verbally through the courts, and hopefully we'll be able to move government beyond the status quo. So let's go to a couple questions. How do you see the decision being applied to First Nations areas that do not have treaties?
Well, I think the way of life is the link, and the court's recognition that the fundamental purpose of the treaty promise was the preservation of the way of life and cultural continuity. And we know that that applies to Section 35 rights outside of the treaties as well. We've had the Supreme Court of Canada say that about Aboriginal rights in a couple of different cases. And so the fundamental promise of Section 35 can't be nullified by the incremental death by 1,000 cuts. And in my view, that's so whether it's promised at the outset or the promise wasn't made in 1900, but it was certainly made in 1982 when Section 35 was brought in. So there's so much commonality in the reasoning. I mean, we have to recognize this fundamentally was based in Treaty 8, but there's so much commonality in the reasoning. We built our argument very much on the Section 35 jurisprudence, not confined to treaty, and the nature of the purposive protections in Section 35, they continue from treaty. So work has to be done, no question. We've got to have, the good work of all the creative legal counsel who work in this area for all of the nations working together toward this. But in my view, the building blocks are very much there because this came out of the Section 35 jurisprudence.
Excellent. Secwepemc Nation MBC was in terms of title, but similar to Blueberry in context of infringement on rights and title. Do these complement each other?
Well, the question of infringement, yes, I would say for sure complements, because the way infringement was measured, and even the questions of justification, again, based very much on the Section 35 jurisprudence and how you measure infringement. So the diminishment, the significant diminishment of the use of the land, the way of life, etc. And certainly we drew upon the court's analysis in Silkatine in our closing arguments in Blueberry. So they very much should weave together, because in our view, this is all building upon an escalating jurisprudence that draws upon Section 35 and title and treaty at the same time. And fundamentally, we should not forget, I mean, it's quite wonderful, but the Queen recognized that the consent of the First Nations was needed in Treaty 8. That is the basis for treaty. It's very much harkens back to the very fundamental nature of what we know about Aboriginal title. So that consent is the basis for the deal that was struck in Treaty 8. And so it's a different deal, it's a different foundation, but it is one that needs to be seen to have launched from the same legal position then, and builds from the same Section 35 jurisprudence now.
All right, last question. Climate change comes to mind and the impact to our salmon. How will this case help with salmon?
Well, there's a couple of, we're dealing with the hotbed of natural gas production in British Columbia. I mean, I should make clear that why Blueberry's cumulative impacts are so bad is because they lie right over the North Montney gas play, as well as, right in the heart of the forestry development in the area. So we have a lot of discussions about gas development coming up. So that's one thing. But beyond that, the large scale planning that's happening it inevitably links to planning around climate change. So there's links to come through planning. And then I think the third point I'd make is that this case was really significant in that it was a major one that after 160 days of trial, where we had credible scientific calls to government from the First Nation that a crisis was building, a crisis was looming, a crisis had arrived, and government inaction was what the nation was faced with. And then we got out of there with an order of the court saying that inaction was inappropriate for many years. Government should have taken that notice seriously, acted with diligence much sooner, and is now compelled to act, and really in a state of increased tension for government now. There's a lot of parallels to what we know about the climate change science and the notice given to government and the scrutiny on inaction. Inactions, I think the courts are increasingly less deferential to inaction. They've been told enough times that this stuff is complicated and just let us do our jobs, which is, a government defense we've heard more than once, and the courts are showing themselves more willing to scrutinize. And I think whether by analogy or by the direct results of planning, I think in both ways we see some helpful building blocks with respect to the broader issues of climate change.
Awesome. Okay, I'll take one more from Nick. Can we draw a line from status quo management of wreck fisheries with minimal monitoring that relies heavily on modeling to policy impact on our rights and ability to have food? I don't get food fish salmon more than once in 4 years.
That's interesting. That question triggers for me a whole area that I didn't talk about that we let a lot of evidence on, which is the really problematic compliance and enforcement system also up in the Northeast. So the one of the major concerns that Blueberry has is that amidst all of this development and the contamination of the waters and the loss of habitat, also there's been a really significant increase in resident hunters and non-resident hunters as well coming up there. And Blueberry's experience has been very little compliance and enforcement, both on industrial developers and in terms of hunting that's happening up there. And frankly, their experience has been that they receive most of the monitoring and enforcement up until really we settled our last piece of litigation about that after this win. Monitoring and enforcement was experienced by Blueberry to be disproportionately aimed at them rather than externally, despite their diminishing returns. So all I can say is that there's an analogy and that experience parallels between the experiences, and Blueberry's win in this case has, as I understand it, refocused government's efforts in terms of monitoring, compliance, and enforcement.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Maegan, and thank you everyone who participated in this great discussion. This concludes our second day of the 2021 Fall Assembly. Thank you for joining us, and we'll continue tomorrow at 1 p.m. So thank you again, and have a great night.